Why did soldiers love brutal choppers in the 13th century?
Get to the chopper!
Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I spend a lot of time on this channel talking about certain historical periods, and there are a few historical periods, I'm afraid, and I apologise, a bit slipped through the cracks, and one of those is this sort of 12th, 13th and even into the 14th century period. Now, I often talk about early medieval periods, so for example the migration, Viking era, Norman conquest, this kind of period. And I often talk about the 15th and 16th centuries, but I don't very much talk about the period in between and the so-called High Middle Ages. And this is a real shame because, of course, they are the absolute epitome of the period of chivalry. Moreover, we actually know an absolute buttload about the arms and armour of that period, have huge historically interesting wars and characters, you know, personages from this period, amazing kings and empires being built, the Angevin Empire and everything like this, and the beginning of the 100 Years' War kind of just after this as well, which really comes out of that. So in this video, I'm just going to talk relatively brief terms about some of the underappreciated types of chopper found in this period. So I'll put the shield down, but purely the reason I'm holding this is really to illustrate the fact that this period is dominated by the use of shields still. Shields drop away in the middle of the 14th century and start to be, certainly for the knightly classes anyway, start to become, two-handed weapons start to become more important due to the prevalence of plate armour, but we'll get to that in a second. But really to point out that really one-handed swords, while two-handed swords do appear in the 13th century, one-handed swords of various types absolutely predominate. Okay, so the use of the shield, the use of a one-handed sword, axe, mace, something like this, or indeed spears still as well, are really the dominant weapon forms for the knightly and the soldiering classes as well. Not to forget that bucklers start to come around in this period as well, but we'll leave that outside of this video, mostly anyway. Right, so why do chopping swords, and I'll talk about each of these swords in a second, why do chopping swords and other cleaving weapons absolutely still dominate in the 13th century? Well, fundamentally, let's set some context for what most soldiers look like in this period. We can get a very good idea if we look at the Morgan Bible, which is something which I use because it's a fantastic artistic resource. The Morgan Bible really shows the spectrum of soldiers. Now, a lot of manuscripts tend to just show knights, so we know what knights are wearing from all sorts of sources. Fundamentally, they are wearing predominantly mail from head to foot. Okay, mail on the legs, long mail hauberks with long sleeves, mitteny hands, covered hands, and various forms of helmet. Now, many people will immediately think of the knightly great helm, and that is an important helmet, particularly for knights. However, it's really, in my view, predominantly a cavalry helmet. We often see knights when they're on foot take off the great helm, and underneath they have either a mail coif, which sometimes has padding underneath, or sometimes actually has a helmet underneath the mail coif, known as a cavalier, and the cavalier gives rise to the early forms of the bassinet. Essentially what we're talking about here is a conical iron helmet, and of course this has been around for hundreds of years. We can see it on the Bear Tapestry. It goes all the way back into the migration, well, even Roman era. Okay, so the simple iron helmet made predominantly of one piece. So the three most, and I'm going to tell you about a third helmet, the three most important helmets in this period are the iron conical helmet. We could call this, what could we call it? Cavalier, we could call it bassinet, an early form of bassinet, or we could just call it the conical helmet, which is sometimes worn by itself, sometimes worn under a great helm. Then there's the great helm worn over the top of that by the heaviest armoured troops, predominantly heavy cavalry, aka knights, men-at-arms. And then the third type of helmet that's very important in this period is the iron hat, or war hat, or chapeau de fer if you prefer to speak French. Okay, so this is essentially a conical helmet with a brim added on. It's no more complicated than that. Now, what's interesting about these three types of helmets is they don't always go with social class. Okay, sometimes the lowest soldier is wearing the iron hat with a brim, but sometimes the knight who's taken his typical helmet that he might have on cavalry use off might also wear an iron hat. So we find knights in iron hats, we find common soldiers in iron hats, we find common soldiers in the typical conical open-faced helmet with a nasal, either with or without a nasal, and we find top-end knights, nobles, kings with that type of helmet as well. The only exception is we don't find the commonest, the lowest class soldiers wearing great helms. Great helms are really something specific to heavy cavalry, aka knights. Okay, so that's the head. We talked about mail. There are some additional defences coming in the 13th century, and I'm not going to, this isn't a deep dive on 13th century armour, maybe I'll do that in the future, but generally speaking, there are already things coming over the torso over the mail. Okay, so under the mail we have a gambeson, and the gambeson as a padded defence is sometimes worn by itself, but I'll come back to that in a second. So we have some degree of subarmalis or padded defence underneath, but it's not as big and bulky as some reenactors wear. Okay, you're not like the Michelin man with like a great big walking duvet. Okay, most armours, most padded defences, or should we say arming doublets, what would later be worn underneath mail, are clearly relatively slim and fitted, because we can look at the shape of the mailed figures and the knights wearing mail. It's fairly close fitting. Okay, so there's probably two levels of padding, and we'll talk about the armour, the fabric armour worn by itself in a second. So for a knight or a well-equipped man-at-arms, you have something under the mail, then you have mail, and then you might have a early coat of plates or some other form of cuirass. Now, let's talk briefly about this. Again, I touched on this in past videos, and I will probably do a deep dive on the coat of plates in the future. That is a type of armour which goes back into the middle of the 1200s. Okay, so the earliest forms of coat of plates appear already in the middle of the 13th century. So we've got plate defences appearing on the body, but the word cuirass, clearly cuir is the French for leather. So probably there were other things sometimes being worn on the torso, but they're hidden under the surcoat. That's why we don't know, okay? Because at this time the surcoat was worn over the mail and it hides what's being worn on the torso. However, from written sources, from effigies, from other artistic sources, sometimes where we can see a gap at the side of the surcoat and things like this, we know that various things were starting to be worn, not by everyone, but by some people, by the most heavily armoured, were starting to be worn over the mail, but under the surcoat. Various types of precursor to what we know as the cuirass, coat of plates, brigandine, breastplate even. Okay, so there are references to iron plates being worn on the chest in the jousting context. There's obviously references to coat of plates. We know that coat of plates existed and we see them artistically. And probably other things, okay, probably maybe hardened leather defences over the chest, maybe with some plates added. We don't know, but things on the body augmenting the mail armour. And finally, we start to see the very first glimpses of plate occasionally on the arms and legs, but this is more of a 14th century thing. Okay, so that's outside the scope of this video. Certainly sometimes elbow and knee cops start to appear at the end of the 13th century, and occasionally greaves are shown, although it has been pointed out that's often in application to Goliath, because Goliath is mentioned as wearing greaves, so therefore they illustrated him with greaves. It doesn't mean that greaves are necessarily common. So we always got to be careful looking at medieval art and extrapolating too much, when sometimes the artist is showing a specific character from myth, legend, the Bible, whatever, and they're not necessarily showing what's common equipment in their own time. Anyway, right. So you can hopefully, from that kind of whistle-stop tour of 13th century armour, and you can just look through the Morgan Bible for yourself online. And the padded defences, gambesons. So people who couldn't afford necessarily the mail and the knightly type of armour, they started to have big old padded gambesons, and these were very clearly more substantial, probably many more layers of linen and perhaps with other things stuffed in there that were more substantial than the type of thing you would normally wear underneath mail. So lowest caste soldiers sometimes might have no armour at all. They might not even have a helmet, and we'll come back to that in a second. Then one level up from them, the equipped militias might have a gambeson and an iron hat or a conical helmet of some kind. And then one level up from them, you'll find people in mail with an open face helmet, head to foot mail with a shield and a spear. And then up from them are the knights and the high armoured men-at-arms, and they might have something under the mail, then maybe a coat of plates, and then either an open face helmet or a great helm, depending on what they're doing, plus their shield, plus their lance, plus their sword or an axe or a mace or whatever. So there's a whole spectrum of armaments. Right, so back to the weapons. So in this period, the typical sword was kind of like this. So this is the beautiful, I think one of the nicest that we did from the Royal Armourers line. So this is the windlass Royal Armourers from the first batch. This is a, you could say Type 14-ish blade. I won't get into typologies there because that gets a bit complicated with this specific sword. But this is essentially a broad, tapering to a point blade. Now this is actually a very interesting sword for this discussion, because this starts to show adaptation to making a sword which is better for thrusting. Now this is a relatively new thing in the 13th century. Why? Because more people have got armour. So prior to this, in the 12th century, for example, certainly in the 11th century, the best armoured people have mail and an open-faced conical helmet with a nasal. Okay, like you'd see on the Bear Tapestry, and that continues right the way through the 12th century. I'm being very careful with this incidentally because I've had this professionally sharpened and it cuts like an absolute demon. This is a monster of a cutter, but I'll get back to that in a second. By the time we get to the 13th century, as I've mentioned, there are more defences coming in, more hardcore helmets, there are probably things going on the torso, over the mail, under the surcoat. The surcoats themselves are probably defensive to some degree, as we see from the stand-up shoulders on some of them. And there might be augmented defences on some of the arms and legs sometimes. So we get to a situation where thrusting is starting to become incredibly more important against armoured opponents, okay? Because just cutting as hard as you can will have a fair amount of effect on someone in mail, because hard defences spread and bridge the energy in ways that mail don't. And if you hit someone really hard in the shin with mail on it with one of these swords, you still stand a good chance of breaking the shin. In some cases, against relatively thinner or iron bits of mail, you might sometimes shear through the mail. We have cut through mail in some tests. It is possible, particularly against wrought iron mail, and if the mail is smaller gauge and that kind of stuff. Thinner wire, essentially. So occasionally you can sort of shear through mail, but mostly it's about cutting force, okay, and energy. But here's why I just gave you a whistle-stop tour of 13th century armour. We're only looking at the knights there, the best armoured people. As we see on the Maciejowski or Morgan Bible, you can see that there are a huge number of soldiers who the knight might be chopping, who aren't wearing head-to-foot mail and have way less equipment on, okay? They've got exposed arms, they've got exposed legs, they might have a really good gambeson on some bit of their body, but there are going to be bits that are exposed. So a broad cutting blade of this kind of relatively thin cross-section is still going to be an incredibly important weapon for cutting through people, essentially, people where there aren't armour. And clearly if you're fighting an armoured opponent, with whether it's with a blooming great falchion, and we'll talk about falchions in a second, or whether it's just a nice big choppy arming sword, then clearly, that's my light fitting there, clearly you're going to aim for the places where armour aren't, particularly legs, particularly faces, arms if they're, forearms or hands, this kind of stuff, okay? But there is another target, and we'll whip out the good old Dane axe here. Now, the large two-handed axe, as featured on the Bear Tapestry, the so-called Dane axe, is still around at this time, and the derivatives of this, okay? Sometimes they've now got a hammer or a spike on the back, and there's various other chopping weapons we'll talk about in a second as well. So clearly this weapon is also going to be very effective against lightly armoured or mailed targets, okay, if not necessarily plate by itself. But there is another really, really important thing in the 13th century which we often overlook. Horses, okay? So chivalry comes from the French word for horse, okay? So the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries were absolutely dominated by the power of heavy cavalry. Okay, now they hadn't yet invented pikes as we know them, or pike blocks, but there were weapons that used at the time which were clearly optimized towards defending against cavalry and taking down horses. So you've got to think about taking down the horse, not just the rider. In many cases, it would be easier to hit the horse than the rider. This is even spoken about in various treatises, actually, including Fiore at the end of, well, beginning of the 15th century. So if you're aiming at hitting horses, which may or may not have armour on them, but certainly are not going to have armour on all of them, then clearly weapons which are good at chopping large pieces of meat and bodies are going to be an important thing. So bringing it back to the swords for a second. While we have on arming swords the adaptation for thrusting through mail or thrusting into gaps, which starts to become more and more important, these swords, and again this is very sharp so I'm going to be careful, these swords are much more flexible and thinner and broader than later 14th and 15th century swords start to be. By the time we get into the full age of plate armour, swords, by necessity, they don't need, for the most of the part, they don't need to be able to cut so well anymore. But what they absolutely need to do is to be able to thrust as effectively as possible. So blades tend to, not always, there's always exceptions, but they tend to get narrower, thicker and stiffer. Okay? And if we look at a typical late 14th century longsword, like some of the others that we replicated from the Royal Armouries line, then indeed some of those are really stiff and they're like a giant rondel dagger. They're designed to punch through mail, gambeson, or anything else that they can find that's not a piece of plate. Okay, in some cases poleaxe points and certain types of sword can even penetrate through thinner plates, but that's obviously not the easiest option. The easiest option is to go for somewhere plate isn't. And also into gaps of helmets, and you know the gaps become smaller essentially, so you need a narrow blade for that. So here we've got the thrusting point is starting to come in the 13th century. That's a new thing. But here's an important point I want to make clear to you. This amazing late 13th century style of sword that comes about, this model on the original in the Royal Armouries, which is an amazing sword, and this one I think we got absolutely spot on with the replica. I've never seen anyone else really making a replica of that sword anywhere near as close as we've got with the windlass one. If you remove that point, okay, so if you just visualise this blade but remove the point there, if you look at the rest of the sword, we've essentially got a sword which functionally is like a Viking era sword. What they've literally done is they've taken the profile, the sort of outlook. Okay, it doesn't have the big broad filler and that kind of stuff, but in terms of the breadth and the thickness, it is like an earlier period migration era sword with an added pointy bit on the end. Okay, so sometimes I think people look at these pointy swords and they think, oh, it's a slender thrusting sword. It ain't. Okay, by and large, this is although it's relatively light, it has got so much authority in that blade. It is a fearsome cutter, one of the best cutters, and this has been professionally sharpened up by Emberleaf Workshops, incidentally. Shout out to Emberleaf. I'm going to see them later today, actually. Top-end knife makers based quite near me. It's been professionally sharpened, basically shaving sharp, by Emberleaf, and this sword cuts like as well as anything else I own. Okay, it's an amazing, for a one-hander anyway, it's an amazing one-handed cutting sword. So while it has the pointy end on it for dealing with, you know, trying to burst through links in mail and thrust into gaps and stuff like this, and this is a relatively new feature in this period anyway, the broad blade and thin cross section and the nature of the edge bevel, very shallow really, angles, very small angles, this is a fearsome cutter. Now, we have to bear in mind, looking back to the Morgan Bible again, who are most of the soldiers on the battlefield? Most of the soldiers on the battlefield aren't knights, okay? On horseback, that's still useful for hitting, if you're a knight, against other knights or against their horses. But most importantly, it's an incredibly useful sword against the massed levies, okay, the normal infantry, the crossbowmen, the whatever you want to call them, the typical infantry, the militias, who are wearing much lighter levels of armour and sometimes no armour at all in the case of archers. So Now we get to the falchion. Clearly this is a specialised weapon. Now I've made a more in-depth video about this in the past where I argued this is absolutely not 100% not an anti-armour weapon. In fact, this is a sort of bastardised replica because the hilt is modelled on the Cluny falchion, or at least inspired by the Cluny falchion, and the blade is inspired by the Conyers falchion. Now, the Conyers falchion is particularly big. The Cluny falchion is much smaller than this. These sorts of swords, yes, you can mash them into armour. Yes, you could absolutely attack a horse with one, or defend yourself from a horse with one. But these are designed for hitting gambeson and flesh. They are not optimised towards hitting armour. They have very thin blades, very fine edges. In fact, in many ways, they're less suited to hitting armour, in my opinion, than the arming sword of the time, because they have such thin and almost fragile edges, especially when we consider these were made with period metallurgy. I think my friend James Elmsley, who is a specialist on falchions, I think he pretty much agrees with me on this. These are essentially like whopping great military machetes. They aren't anti-armour weapons like something like a warhammer would be. There's no question that a warhammer is good at smashing into armour. Falchion, not really so much. So it is important to note that just because in something like modern bowhurt, they like falchions because they hit with more force, the modern bowhurt falchion is very little like a real historical falchion. It's very thick and blunt and stiff, relatively short as well. It's essentially a mace, okay? So the modern bowhurt falchion, because it's blunt and thick and hits with more energy, is functionally a mace, okay? Whereas the real falchions have very thin, flexible, light and sharp blades. They are not designed for mashing into helmets. They're designed for chopping through meat. Right, okay. Finally, we're going to get on to the other cleavers that appear in this period, and they will very much follow the theme that you've just seen there. So the Dane axe is still around, unadulterated. We still see these absolutely in period. But there are more evolved forms of it. We find types with longer blades, for example. They tend to be thicker than period Dane axes, which might come back to my theory about these being for chopping horses more than for armoured people, although probably most people weren't armoured at that time, although anyway, that's a complicated topic. The axe blades tend to be as big as this, but they tend to be thicker than this as we get into the 12th and 13th century. And sometimes they might have a spike on the back or some other... we even see the early forms of what becomes the poleaxe and the halberd already in the 13th century. So they're starting to become more specialised in one sense, but also more varied in their abilities to dish out harm. Now, it is very evident when we look at all 13th century sources, but particularly the Morgan Bible most famously, that there are all manners of cleaver in there. There's two-handed cleavers, there's one-handed cleavers, there's blooming great axes, there's all sorts of things that chop. And I would argue this is for two main reasons. Number one, most people on the battlefield at this time might have a bit of armour, but they don't have all-encompassing armour or enough armour or the right type of armour to stop the incredibly powerful chops of these sorts of weapons, or even these sorts of weapons in many cases. Okay, so number one, chopping is still really important in the 13th century because plate armour hasn't come in yet, except for the occasional coated plates. So most people have got exposed things to chop. And secondly, cavalry. Again, we come back to my old horse chopping theory, okay? If you're an infantryman, one of your major concerns is being attacked by those guys over there on really big horses with lances, okay? So yeah, you're going to have some spears. You might try and put yourself behind some kind of, rise in the ground or some stakes or this kind of stuff. You are constantly thinking about how to defend against the cavalry. If we look, even in early 14th century, if you look at the Edward I's wars in Scotland, the main concern, and you could look at Wales as well actually, the main concerns of the North Welsh and the Scots is Edward's cavalry. The whole development of the schiltron, the use of the large spears and the way that they put themselves on top of a hill to slow the cavalry down, it's all dominated by cavalry. Yes, things like crossbows are really important in the 13th century, but the main counter to crossbows is charging more cavalry. So everybody is worried about cavalry. So your weapons have to be effective not only against humans, but against horses, those massive horses that are charging you down and are going to trample you into the mud at great speed with armoured people on top of them with lances. So your weapons have to be suited to, yes, sometimes hitting knights, but they also have to be suited to chopping opponent infantry who are not wearing very much armour, charging into archers and crossbowmen who often would have no armour or minimal armour, and finally to chopping up horses. So, to conclude, swords at this time and all other weapons, axes, cleavers, falchions, all of these sorts of weapons that were popular in the 13th century, in my opinion, are dominated by two important features. Number one, most people on the 13th century battlefield do not have armour or don't have the type of armour that will really protect them from heavy cleaving blows, firstly. Secondly, the 13th century battlefield is absolutely dictated, dominated and overwhelmed by heavy cavalry. So your weapons have to be useful against horses, defending against horses and attacking horses. So there we go. Maybe we'll do some deeper dives in the future into specific aspects of these 13th century weapons and indeed the 13th century armour, because 13th century armour is rather underappreciated and very, very cool. But anyway, for now, I have been Matt Easton. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope we'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.